Good morning, everyone, and welcome to Latin America Reflects on the U.S. in Time of Crisis webinar. My name is Marta Blackwell, and I'm the Vice President of the Canadian Council for the Americas. We're extremely pleased to be partnering with Global Americans today for many reasons, not least of which is to welcome and introduce their new Executive Director, Guy Mentel, on a public forum. He'll correct me if I'm wrong about this, but I do think that this is one of his first public events as executive director, so we're very pleased to be doing that with them. We also encourage you to visit their website, theglobalamericans.org, and subscribe to the weekly newsletter for analysis on the region that seeks to broaden discussion of the Americas within the global context. So do invite you to check out their website and sign up for their newsletter. For those of you who don't know us, the Canadian Council for the Americas, we're Canada's premier forum for the discussion of the critical political and economic issues in the hemisphere. And just most recently, since March, we've hosted over 12 events on the COVID-19 pandemic in the region, discussing specifically the public health as well as the economic impacts. So we invite you to visit our website at ccacanada.com to see those and other CCA initiatives. I'll just take a moment to highlight another joint initiative, the initiative that we have with Global Americans, and that is a podcast entitled Two Gringos with Questions. It's co-hosted by Chris Sabatini, the founder of Global Americans, who's now at Chatham House in London, and CCA President Ken Frankel. Just to highlight some of the most recent interviewees include Francis Fukuyama, Tim Reeser, for those not in DC, he's a longtime Senate staffer, former New Zealand Prime Minister Helen Clark, President of Univision News, Daniel Coronel, and that podcast is available on SoundCloud, iTunes, and Spotify, and easily accessible on either of our websites. So for today's event, we do invite you to write questions in the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. Just a note that we may or may not get to all of them due to time and all of that. So, but we do invite you to access us that way. And now I'll get to the introduction of our speakers. I don't know that they actually need an introduction, but I will take the moment. So first we've got Robert Funk. He's a professor at the University of Chile, as well as a columnist at Capital Magazine. Soledad Loaeza, she's a professor at Colegio de México. Gabriel Silva, former ambassador to the US and a columnist for El Tiempo in Colombia. And Ilona Szabo Carvalho, executive director of Igarapé Institute and columnist at Folho, S.Paulo in Brazil. And then we have your two co-moderators, as I mentioned, Guy Mentel, executive director of Global Americans, and our president, Kenneth Frankel, for the Canadian Council for the Americas. So with that, I will hand it over to your co-moderators, and thank you all for joining us again.
Thank you very much, Marta. Hi, Guy. Pleasure to welcome to the joint production today.
Thanks, Ken. Real excited to be here.
Yeah, good. Normally when we do these webinars, we do a little bit of a setup piece to explain why we're doing and what we're trying to achieve. I think in this case, the title of the webinar is pretty self-explanatory. Everybody listening and everybody certainly on this panel has a very good idea of what's going on in the United States. The question is, how does Latin America view this? And it's particularly interesting to ask Latin America how it views this at a time when a number of countries in Latin America are going through their own bits of civil unrest, and some of it more than just a few bits of civil unrest, something a lot more, which as of late is on a bit of a hiatus because of coronavirus, but I don't think there's anyone here who, speaking today or probably listening, who thinks that these issues aren't going to resurface at least with the same kind of vehemence that we saw them earlier, and perhaps even expand into new issues that have come up through the crisis that we're going through now. We thought we would start this webinar by asking each of the panelists to answer just some basic questions about what is the awareness in your country about the current political turmoil in the United States? What is the general feeling? Is this view shared by all sectors in society? Is there a feeling that this crisis in the United States, the unrest and the political crisis, is temporary and will abate, might even abate further with, for example, the election of Joe Biden? Or is this something that is viewed as being more deep-seated, more fundamental, and is going to take a longer time to sort out, if it gets sorted out properly? So with that series of questions, maybe I'll ask Robert, who's sitting in Santiago, if you could talk a little bit about the view from Chile. Robert?
Hi, thanks, Ken, and Guy, and everybody. I guess in Chile, the view is a little bit of one of deja vu. As you know, we were kind of the overture to much of the protest going on, first in Colombia, then we saw some things in Brazil as well, and certainly in the United States. Of course, the root causes are different. The issue of racism in the United States is quite sui generis. It's a particularly American phenomenon in the way that it plays out there. But there are some similar issues, underlying issues, which are common both to the United States and to Chile, and people understand that. People see it like that. People in Chile certainly see the American protest through the lens of inequality, through the lens of racial discrimination or social discrimination or economic discrimination, unequal access to services, to healthcare, which I think is also an underlying thing in the States in the context of the coronavirus. So all of those things were very present in the Chilean protests, and Chileans tend to see, I guess people everywhere, but tend to see events elsewhere through a prism of their own problems and their own experience. And I think that's what's happening in Chile. And with regard to whether different sectors of society see it the same way, I think different sectors of society in Chile see it through the prism that they saw events here in Chile. So those who might have been concerned about all the issues I just mentioned and inspired them to go out and protest, they see that. Those who see a bunch of people possibly being egged on by foreign ideologies or foreign powers, the way that President Piñera suggested at the beginning of our protest, the way that President Trump has suggested, see it that way as well. But certainly, for the most part, there's a lot of concern in Chile. There's an understanding that the United States is an important power in the region. It's not really playing its traditional role, and that there's some unease about that as well.
Thank you, Robert. Ilona, what's the feeling in Brazil?
Well, Brazil, we're living our many crises, but as I think the other panelists will just say here, what happens in the US has profound effects, right, across Latin America, not least in Brazil. So this mismanagement of COVID by Trump has influenced Brazil as well, and the outbreak of protests and the rise of Black Lives Matter are big news. So big news in the mainstream, but also social media, and now on the streets, even in the midst of our also very challenging situation with COVID. But the reaction is also split in a way. Most Brazilians, including partly those that did vote for President Bolsonaro, and now some of them regret, has been surprised and deeply concerned by what is happening in the US. But I would say a smaller number of those who still support Bolsonaro regard Trump as a leader and the US as a model. So, this is a long perception. So the Brazil, but it's just important to note that Brazil is a very unequal country. So there is still a significant portion of our population who don't have any idea of what is happening in the US. So this is also true. But I would say informed public opinion in general has a big concern. Also because President Bolsonaro adores Donald Trump and publicly emulates him. So this affects us overwhelmingly what happens in the US. And I would say that we are very concerned about the November elections, as I would say the future of democracy, human rights, and also the moral standing of including our country will hinge a lot on how the US will deal with this crisis.
Thank you, Ilona. Soledad, do you want to talk a little bit about how this is playing out in Mexico? If there's one country in Latin America that knows the United States only too well, it would be Mexico. How is this playing there? Soledad, do you have are you on mute? You may be, you may have the mute button. Okay, why don't we skip from, we'll come back to Soledad. Gabriel, do you want to talk about how this is playing out in Colombia?
Right.
Okay, sorry, great.
I'm sorry. Well,
the floor is yours.
In Mexico, it would be very difficult for me to say how people are reacting to what is happening in the States. I have some general ideas on the basis of what I think I know about Mexican culture and reactions to the US. I can very well imagine that some of the reactions have been of shock. To see police brutality on television has been, I think, a very strong experience for most Mexicans. And the fact is that our experience is that when we look at law enforcement agents in the US reacting as they do, as we have seen on television, we tend to identify with the victim. We don't have a very good image of the US police. As you say, our experience with the US might be different from the experience of other Latin American countries. So when you see these images, you tend to identify with the unarmed protester and also with the victim. You see them as victims more than as trespassers. I think that most Mexicans, we are very, I don't know how aware we are of what is happening. I mean, in terms of the population, the whole of the population. But I think that political society, as you call them, are very much aware of it. And we are surprised, shocked, but at the same time, we feel, I think, very unsure and very insecure about the future. What is happening in the States is introducing a very strong element of uncertainty in our considerations about the future. And it is more, I think, it is stronger in Mexico than in other countries because we are so much tied, so closely tied to the US that we know that whatever happens over there is going to have repercussions in Mexico. I also think that the reaction to events in the US is a little bit, has been somehow silenced by the fact that we are very much involved in what is an important political situation. I don't dare call it a crisis yet, but we are going through certainly to political turmoil because the new president for 18 months, Andrés Manuel López Obrador, has started or has been trying for the last 18 months to dismantle whatever reforms were introduced in the last 25 years. And that is a very disturbing project. We don't know what he's planning to build. We already know what he has destroyed or what he's destroying. And that is also very disturbing. So this marches and this the political turmoil in the US is also disturbing in Mexico because we don't like, most Mexicans dislike President Trump. President Trump has been, I'm sure you're aware, he has been particularly offensive to Mexicans. Not only the wall, but he has referred to Mexicans in very, very despising terms. And, but President López Obrador has been incredibly, patient. He has been friendly to President Trump, although President Trump hasn't been friendly to Mexicans. And President López Obrador, also as Bolsonaro, sees Trump as a model. And I think he's about the only person, I don't know if Bolsonaro has said that, but López Obrador has said, and I think he's the only person on earth who has said that he wants to be like Trump. And he wants to be a good friend of Trump's, which is extraordinary. I don't know if it's a political strategy. He hasn't been clear on that. But I think that maybe it's a political strategy recognizing how Mexico's fate is tied to the US. Anyway, I think that the impact of events in the US has been to increase uncertainty in Mexico. And also, I think that it has been perceived as a reinforcement of López Obrador, even though their political their political positions on different matters are very different. And I would also mention the fact that the race issue in Mexico had not been raised before. And it was raised in marches that were organized in the last few weeks, protesting against López Obrador. And that is very unprecedented. In Mexico, we felt that we had solved the race issue, and now this has been has been used by protesters, and that's a break with the past. Many things have been happening that are without precedent. So I don't know what is going to happen.
Thank you, Soledad. We will come back to the race issue for sure. Thank you for that. Gabriel, we should move to you now. Colombia is one of those countries late last fall that had its own version of civil unrest. And as we said at the top of this webinar, nobody believes that is going to subside when the current lockdown, COVID lockdown, starts to loosen a lot more in Colombia. You want to talk a little bit about how this is playing out in Colombia?
Let me start by saying that Colombians look very positively in general to the US. Of course, that's not across the board, but the attitude is in general positive. But it was extremely euphoric when President Obama was in power. President Obama is probably the American leader after Kennedy that it has been most popular among Colombians. So this deception, this disappointment with the US started before the current situation in your cities, in the US cities, excuse me. So what we see is that from a euphoric, positive vibe towards the US, with the arrival of Trump and his first America attitude, his attitude against multilateral organizations, against cooperation, the environment started to change. And that change has turned quite acute with the marches and with the George Floyd event. The perception now is that basically the dream and the exceptionality of the US is false. It's like discovering that Mickey Mouse is not real. It's really like that kind of feeling. Disneyland is not true. And we are seeing in the US cities the same things we see here. So that aura of greatness of the American experiment is really eroding very, very fast. And I think that across the board, of course, we have differences among social classes and among interest groups, but in general, the attitude is we cannot count on the US anymore. They are in deep trouble, they are in difficulties that are going to last, and they are just looking towards themselves, and they are not going to be an active part of building a new approach to the Americas. So in a way, it's like a feeling of solitude, in the sense that the US is not going to be a partner or an enemy, is going to be irrelevant. The sense of irrelevancy of the US is really what is emerging as a major feeling among Colombians. I imagine that some of that is also felt in the countries of my colleagues here. But in general, that's what I would say, and I believe that it's going to also impact the political situation in Colombia, in the sense that will enhance the protests, will enhance the questioning of the elites, is going to enhance the criticism of democracy. And for me, that's the critical point. When you have an idea, you have a Mickey Mouse that is the US democracy, and you discover it's just a drawing, then it's a drawing, and you are trying to imitate Mickey Mouse, and Mickey Mouse doesn't exist. So it's a realization that democracy, as we understood it, is really failing everywhere. And that's very dangerous for Colombia and for Latin America.
Ambassador, I'd like to, I'll go back to you and we'll go around the horn again. I want to kind of dissemble the Mickey Mouse, if you will. Is there a feeling, if we can zero in on these democratic freedoms and institutions, is there a feeling in Colombia, but across the region, that freedom of the press, freedom to protest, impartial justice, fair elections, all of these things that we associate with the United States' democratic experience, how significantly are they threatened, and how reversible are the trends of today? And is that view shared by sectors across society? And if so, is Colombia starting to look towards other countries as standard bearers of democracy?
Well, I think that there is a very interesting article by Richard Haas recently that he argues that this crisis at home affects and makes the US very vulnerable abroad. And I fully agree. I think that the lack of legitimacy in the exertion of power is part of the problem of what is going on in the US. The US is losing its legitimacy, and therefore the institutions associated with American democracy, like Colombian democracy, are all being questioned. Say, what if they don't work in paradise, why they should work here? They're also fake. They're also just a facade. So I think that in general, this feeling has been aggravated or has been increasingly more critical, because with the COVID situation, with the coronavirus situation, what is going on with the exceptional powers that the state is taking to technically manage the crisis, the public health crisis, people are resenting the state and seeing that when the state wants to act in an authoritarian way, they can do it. And the mistrust towards the democratic institutions and their effectiveness is increasing. They don't see them working in the US, and they're not seeing them working in relation to the pandemic. So it's a mixture that is quite dangerous, and we are seeing a kind of deception by a feeling of frustration, that democracy is a deception, that democracy in general is not believable.
Soledad, I'd love to direct that question to you in Mexico. Again, with the Mickey Mouse metaphor that we've already set up, are there particular elements of the United States of America's democratic experience that Mexico feels are most threatened? Freedom of the press, with words and catchphrases like fake news, or enemies of the people. Are there parts of the democratic experience that draw greatest alarm in Mexico? And again, the same question is Mexico beginning to look towards other countries? Are people on the ground in Mexico beginning to look towards other countries as standard bearers of democracy?
In the case of Mexico, because of our historical experience with the US, our evaluation of American democracy has always been very critical. We tend to question American democracy because of its behavior towards Mexico. So it's not so much that we look at the U.S. as a democratic model, although we recognize that it's was the first democracy in the world. What is very disturbing, what we are all discussing right now, is the role the U.S. played in Latin America before, in the last century. Was it like a backbone for Latin American governments? Did it have like a disciplinary effect on Latin American governments? Now, today that the U.S. has been more or less indifferent to Latin America, all this is happening. That is a question that has been bothering me for the last few months, because it would be very disturbing to recognize that there was this effect on the part of the U.S. Instead of talking of the U.S. as a domineering power in Latin America, as a disciplinary force in Latin America, for Latin American countries. I think that it would be very disturbing for us, for the U.S. to go in the direction that it has been taking in the last months, because we wouldn't have a model that we recognize as such. I don't think we are looking at other countries as model, although the European experience, the social democratic European experience, has always been very attractive. But we don't have, we haven't been able to develop that. Although we don't have for instance, we don't have a bipartisan political system. We have a multi-party system, more or less following a European model more than the US model. And at the same time, we have a presidential regime that is similar to the US. And the presidentialism that is developing in the US under President Trump is terrifying, because that is really a model for the Mexican president. And many of the measures, the policies that President López Obrador has been introducing have been introduced on the basis of presidential power, more or less the same thing as Trump has been doing in the US. So the model of the presidential regime can be very strong and very attractive for Mexican presidents, not so much a model of American democracy. I don't know if we can make the difference between the two.
Thank you, Soledad. I'd like to take a piece of what Soledad just said, Robert, and direct it towards you. The piece, namely, about the U.S. having been, as Soledad says it, the backbone, perhaps, of democratic experiments in Latin America in recent decades. I know you've written, Robert, in Chile about a lot of the protests being a sort of rebellion against the status quo. Do you see the absence of American leadership in the region, if we agree that there is such an absence, as creating the space for this sort of rebellion against the status quo, because there is no, as Soledad puts it, backbone holding up the democratic experiments in the region?
I'd make a couple of points there. The first is yes. Does it create a space to rebel against the status quo? It does, in the sense that for many people, the United States represents the status quo. And especially in Chile, where we have been living under an economic model, which is now being questioned, which is very much associated, it's called the Chicago Boys. It's associated with a particular school and a particular university, which happens to be in a particular country. So I think that does create a space for questioning the American role. Now, one thing I'd like to, I think is important to say, the American retreat from the region did not begin with Trump and did not begin with the protests of the last few weeks. The American retreat from the region probably began, I don't know, September 11, 2001, or maybe earlier, I don't know. President Obama recognized this. I believe he gave a speech in Chile where he almost sort of apologized for the American role in the historic role in the region, and basically confirmed or announced that the United States was no longer willing or able to play the role that it has historically done. And that was Obama's attitude in Syria and in the Middle East and in many places. So the part of this has to do with the changing nature of the balance of power in the international system and the American role in that system and American public opinion. and not just with Trump. Of course, this has deepened with Trump. Trump has been much more explicit about it. America First is about that. The third point, I think, has to do with what models we are looking at. And I think Soledad here is right. Yes, there's Chile, I guess all our countries are fractured. Chile is perhaps more fractured than some because we have the wounds of the past that never really healed. If you ask a social democrat, they will say they look towards Europe. If you ask someone further on the left, they will say they look perhaps to, I don't think no one looks towards Venezuela anymore, but they look towards Argentina perhaps with some admiration. And if you ask someone on the right, they'll probably say the States, or they'll say Bolsonaro, and not because they think that they've done a fantastic job, but they're very happy to have a United States that kind of that leaves them alone and does not, if you want to be authoritarian, if you want to be populist, if you want to go one way to go another way, the United States is not going to get involved. The other interesting thing is that China is not a model. Doesn't seem to be really a model either. So perhaps not yet. Perhaps China's role in the region is not yet consolidated enough, but we don't seem to be there yet. I would make those points.
Great. Thanks so much, Robert. Ilona, I'd love to direct the question to you as well. Given the democratic ruptures that we're seeing in Brazil, how much do you think there is this interplay between the Brazilian experiment and potential erosion of democratic norms in the US? And again, the same question is, do you see both at the top of the Brazilian government and among the chattering classes, do you see a country looking towards other countries as potential standard bearers of democracy?
Sure, I would say that a lot of Gabriel, Soledad, and also Robert already said it's true to Brazil. So we had, it's the democracy of the US as this ideal, even though, partly Brazilians also knew the problems in the US, but it was always a kind of example, a goal to be aspired to. So the sense that it's coming unstuck is deeply unsettling, and I believe the consequences are very far-reaching. When you see the playbook that I call, like that Donald Trump uses with the tactics, for example, in terms of cracking down on civic freedoms, removing checks and balances, the constitutional hardball game, attacking the press and science, abusing executive power, this is being emulated absolutely by the president of Brazil, but as others speak here, by other countries also, where what I say this rise of the populist authoritarian leaders are happening. So in a way, when you see just the consequences of, for example, the next elections, I do believe that this won't solve everything, but would at least put the world back in a trajectory that we see developments. The feeling with Trump is that we just lost so much ground to the process of achieving more equal societies. And in that sense, where we're looking at, I would say that Europe is a big reference for Brazilians, especially also because they're important trade partners. And there's a lot of, I would say, the kind of conversation that the US used to have with Brazil in terms of respecting human rights and so on. This environment, this has really shifted to Europe. So we see now that the moral grounds are being held there. And to the younger generation, I think also Canada, when you see progressive leadership in terms of gender equality and other issues that have disappeared in the agenda, for example, drug policy reform, things that are I would say, speak more to the younger population. So I would say these countries in Europe, Canada, and the female leadership that has been arising with the COVID crisis also has been, I would say, we have very few role models today. And I think on the positive side, in the midst of this chaos, is that we're seeing that also the female characteristics of leadership, that is not only, not only women can have that, might give some light to what is happening. But definitely I'd say that the US is the big disappointment, but a big threat, is as I think Robert said also China is neither, I mean, it's also not a model in terms of where we want to go as a society, our freedoms, our rights, but still a very important economic partner. So we're there in a very strange situation when you think about the needs of economic relationships and where as a society we want to go. But terrifying, but we need to make sure we give new examples and possibilities to the younger generations that are very disappointed with politics in general.
Thank you, Ilona. I want to pick up on the point of what an amazing example Canada would be for the world. I have to, we have to inject some good Canadian content into this. But before we come to that and a couple other questions, I wanted to go to Gabriel. I think who wanted to make a point about the military in Colombia with respect to what we've been just discussing. Gabriel, did you want to make a comment?
Yes, I think that one of the roles that we have seen the U.S. in the past play with quite a forceful attitude is like a deterrent to the violation of human rights and the defense of liberties. And I can tell you as a former Minister of Defense that the interaction with the U.S. and through aid was very helpful for me to keep a check on things that no one wanted happening among the militaries. So when the military all around, and Colombia is no exception, start feeling that there's no one looking behind them on their shoulder what they are doing, they tend to loosen their behavior and to loosen their practices in relation to human rights and freedom of the press. In Colombia, we have two big related to freedom of the press scandals. One was the threatening of a New York correspondent because he revealed some initial attitudes by the military, by some military, related to extrajudicial killings. And also, more recently, quite broad exercise of espionage over leaders and journalists. So I think that it has a lot to do, believe it or not, with the fact that the Trump government is sending a message that he doesn't care. And now the aid provided to the Colombian military is unrestrained in terms of requiring certain levels of compliance. Unfortunately, I have to admit that that's the case, again, partially among certain units of the military, but that's very, very troublesome because the laxitude by the Trump administration towards the performance in terms of human rights all around the world is that lack of message, the lack of commitment is really creating a new breed of authoritarian behavior by the military force all around.
That's a good point, Gabriel. Okay, so let's work with that and combine it with some of the other issues we wanted to get to. Essentially, Gabriel, if I understand, you're talking about the actions of the Trump government at home and abroad, specifically in Colombia, but not just Colombia, but their coddling of dictators throughout the world is giving license to the most undemocratic actors in, certainly, you said in Colombia, and the question is whether in Latin America it's giving that license to those people to act out their anti-democratic impulses. So let's go around with that. I guess the question I'd have for the panelists is, first of all, to use Gabriel's earlier metaphor, the discovery that Mickey Mouse doesn't exist, or as often is said that actually Santa Claus isn't real, is that irretrievable? In other words, if the damage that's been done over the last at least several years, we can posit, is that something that with a Biden victory, for example, and the Democrats winning Congress, for example, would that be something that that the panelists believe could reverse this course in a major way that the United States is on, or would it be viewed as maybe it would slow certain things down, but it's on a very, very difficult, divisive path right now. And this disillusion in the United States and its ability to be one of the beacons for democracy, albeit imperfect, like every country, that'll be hard for the United States to regain. Why don't we start, Robert? We'll start with you on that. Is this irretrievable? Once Humpty Dumpty has fallen off the wall, can he be put back together again, somewhat in the same way? And is it engendering the worst impulses in the anti-democrats forces in Chile?
I think there's no question, and we've seen, we have political leaders in Chile, who have become closer to Bolsonaro, who try to emulate that kind of style, and also, to Trump, or if not Trump personally, to that kind of universe. We see that going on. We saw, for example, in Chile, when the protests emerged after the 18th of October, we saw a phenomenon which was quite similar to what some things we've seen in the States, which was people on the other side going out with sticks, and they sort of copied the yellow jacket phenomenon from France, and they put on these yellow jackets and go out with sticks and hard hats, and there was a little bit of violence. It could have been much worse. I mean, I witnessed some sort of two groups on opposite corners yelling at each other, and sort of, and it could, with police in the middle, and it could have been worse than it actually was. So I think those groups are looking at Trump, or feel emboldened by Trump. And as to where this goes going forward, I don't think anything is irreversible. I still, the United States still has the economic and military power that it has, which gives it a role in the world if it chooses to use it. A lot depends on what happens in November, of course. If Trump is reelected, then that's a different story. If he's not reelected, and if Congress is you get a balance of power that is suitable in Congress, we could have had it to some degree, and maybe not to this degree. We could have had the discussion about George W. Bush after Iraq, where even the president of Chile took a leading role in kind of standing up to Bush, and the United States' role in the world had sunk quite low, and yet it kind of recovered, and yet Obama then changed it quite quickly. It'll take more work, and the other thing that I would mention is it depends a lot on the external factors which also have given rise to this whole phenomenon. I mean, how much will outside forces interfere in the American political system? There was an election yesterday in Georgia, which was a disaster. We don't know how this election is going to be carried out, what the role of Russia is going to be, what the role of COVID is going to be. So there's a lot of things that going forward, or there's a lot of forces going forward that might still interfere in even the best intentions that the United States might have. I wanted to talk very quickly about your Canada. I feel the need to refer to your Canada question.
Thank you, Robert.
And I've said this in Chile a lot. I think in Chile in particular, some people say that if you took a map of the Americas and turned it upside down, Chile would kind of be the mirror image in terms of our Pacific coast, in terms of some of the industries that we have are very similar to Canada, but also in terms of some of the indigenous issues that we've had to face. And increasingly, we're facing issues of immigration and how to integrate immigrants, and whether we want to go the multicultural route or what kind of route we want to go. We don't know yet how to integrate those groups. In terms of gender equality, as Ilona mentioned, or sexual minorities, and also interesting in terms of things like social programs and healthcare. After the October protests, the number 2 answer of what in public opinion polls, when you ask Chileans what they were protesting for and what they wanted to achieve, the number 2 answer after, I'm not sure what the first one was, maybe a new constitution, the number 2 was better healthcare. And certainly Canada has some lessons, it's not perfect in Canada, but some lessons in how to implement a broader, more equitable healthcare and social services. So there's a lot of things, at least for Chile, that we have to probably talk about with Canada going forward.
Thanks, Robert. I want to come to Ilona and Soledad on the same question of the view of whether the decline in the U.S. or the perception of the U.S. is irreversible, and if not, to what extent could change in political fortunes in the U.S. rehabilitate the perception of the U.S. And restore it to the kind of, as we said, imperfect but democratic example, one of the leading democratic examples in the world. And we're talking to now Ilona and Soledad, who've just already spoken about the love between the presidents in their countries with Donald Trump. But having said that, let me go to Ilona first, and then to Soledad. If you could talk a little bit about, obviously there is a perception shared amongst many in Brazil, as you highlighted, Ilona, of the deep concern about what's going on in the U.S. And I think, as you said earlier, what does this mean for Brazil and democracy if this is what's happening in the U.S.? Do you want to talk a little bit about that issue of irretrievability and the view of whether, I'll leave it right there with you.
Sure. I think, there are many similarities, apart from all the differences between the U.S. and Brazil, in the sense of, like, the U.S. is such an unequal society. And I think this crisis and Trump has just made it so visible. So there's a divide because of the style in politics, which has to rule by dividing, by creating this polarization. But also, I think it just allowed for things that were maybe disconsidered or just touched on surface to emerge as like a potent also source for change. So this was not only because of COVID, but with COVID, I think the inequalities are so clear, are so crystal clear. And then I think we're going to be able to touch the issue on police brutality later on. So I think there is a way forward for, Biden or any, democratic, not only the party name, but like any democratic really leader that comes forward, which has to do with bridging this divide, and bridging the divide not only on the political right or left, but on the society, as like tackling the deep inequalities. And in the US, has to do, with the whole discussion on the health system, the affordability of housing, on the penal situation that just tries to push minorities and the Black people out of being voters, being citizens. So there's so much there. And unless this is very much tackled and not dismissed or just touched on the surface, I think it's gonna hard to bridge the divide. So I would go from like tackling inequality and bridging and having a really like America for all message truly implemented, which will take decades, not only one presidency. But then I think there is a way forward, and I really hope we do. They do, because it involves all of us.
Thank you, Ilona. So, Soledad, this is a great question for you about how you see the change in political forces after the elections, the potential change, how that would affect your view and the view perhaps of the state of, we can use the word crisis or we'll use the word crisis in the United States.
Well, I think that the US is very good. Americans are very good at comebacks. They are very good at second chances. So I believe that they will be able to rebuild some of the things that have been destroyed in the last years. And I was thinking of Margaret Atwood, a Canadian, and her dystopia. And somehow it was to me, I was very impressed by her capacity, her ability to foresee what may happen in the US. More or less, that's how I understood her book, her novel. But what I think that the main problem in the US, and I don't know if they're going to be able to solve it, Ilona has mentioned it, and it's the inequality of the Black community. How is it going? Are they going to be able to integrate them, or are they going to remain on the same course, having a divided society? Because Black communities can prosper and live parallel to white communities, but they don't mix still after all these years. And this is a gap that they haven't been able to close. And I don't know if they will be able to close, because it has such a weight, such a historical weight, that it seems to be very difficult to bridge. But I believe that the important thing for us, for Mexicans, in what is happening in the US, is that our president is following the steps of Trump. He really believes that Trump is a great model because he's popular, I suspect, because he has this very good percentages in the polls. And our president, that's what he's looking for. And also, although Andrés Manuel López Obrador presents himself as a president of the left, he's a very conservative man, and his policies are incredibly conservative. He comes very close to Trump in many respects, in many issues. And that's why many people are protesting now. Not that Trump is looking backwards, as López Obrador is, but in the sense that he really believes in, I think, in a stable, in a almost paralyzed society. That is what López Obrador has in mind. I do believe that the Americans are going to be able to rebuild themselves. I do believe that what is happening now is very, very bad for Trump's chances in December. And, well, I don't know. For us, it is important. It is very important what the results of the election, the presidential election, are going to be. And what about Canada as a model? Hopefully. Canada has this European touch we mentioned a few minutes ago, with the social democrat, with this social legislation, which is important. And it has managed to create a multicultural society. And I believe that Canadians are incredibly civilized. I don't know if it's the weather or what, but they are very civilized. And I would be very happy to have a Canadian model. And I suppose, I don't know how long it would take. It would really take for Canada to become more influential in Latin America than it's been until now. Because Canada didn't want to be part of the hemisphere for a long time, I suspect, until the 70s. Is then when Canada started looking at the hemisphere.
Has been on and off, particularly since the late 60s. Yeah.
So now if you're looking at Latin America or if you're looking at yourselves as part of the hemisphere and not anymore as part of Europe, maybe you can introduce a balancing factor in the hemisphere. That would be great.
I'd like to pick up, Soledad, on what you mentioned and kind of direct the question to Ilona. I think we would be remiss if we went this entire engaging conversation without mentioning part of the crisis that is occurring now. I'm here in DC in the aftermath of the tragic killing of George Floyd here in the United States. And Ilona, I'd like to ask how that has reverberated in Brazil in particular, a country where the vast majority of police violence over the past few years has been against Black Brazilians. The most recent, of course, is the 14-year-old young Black teenager, João Pedro Matos Pinto, who was tragically struck in a police pursuit of other men in a drug crackdown. But there's generally been a crackdown of the favelas as of late, even under these government-mandated shutdowns. And I'm wondering if you could speak a little bit to the interplay of the Brazilian and American protests, and perhaps how the existence of the latter, of the American protests, might elevate the sense of urgency in the former.
Sure. Thank you, Guy, for the question. I've been working for almost 2 decades in trying to reduce violence, and especially gun violence in the country, in the region. So I would say that the killing of George Floyd resonates immensely in Brazil. And I think the fact that it was taped, that we saw for almost 9 minutes a man being executed. When I work with these issues for many years, but when I saw that video, I had like it had a severe impact on me. And I think I can say that it had a severe impact on the psyche of Brazilians and of many people across the world, because too often these events go undocumented. So in the US and in Brazil as well, and too often it's young Black men who we know that are disproportionately killed. So just to put as a perspective, the US has around 1,000 police killings a year, a country of roughly 328 million people. In Brazil, we have 6,000 killings, police killings a year, and we have 210 million people. So when the protests erupt in the US, we have immediately the connection and the same name, Black Lives Matter in Portuguese, Vidas Negras Importam, like immediately coming, very strong in social media. And now this whole discussion is if they can take the streets, because Brazil is now the epicenter of the COVID crisis. But we saw in different cities that they're taking the streets. So it's not that Trump and Bolsonaro are responsible for police brutality in our countries. It's before them, but it worsened. And I think this feeling that you can record and the policemen are seen to be doing that and don't stop, this kind of a mandated, I'd say, violence is something new and very dangerous. And it has to do with the questions of how reversible this is once this is out. But just on the positive note, I think we see some very important shifts, because in Brazil, the question of race is not an open one. It's generally covered over debates on class. In the US, the race questions are always like there. But for the first time, we see in Brazil big influencers giving space for Black activists to speak out in their own social media profiles. We're seeing the demand to have diversity and anti-racist policies in companies, institutions around the country. And, we have such a big legacy, negative legacy. We had almost 5 million slaves coming from Africa to Brazil. I think almost 10 times what the US had in terms of Afro-Americans coming up. So I just believe that this fate of how we deal with race, and again, Canada, on the multicultural of Brazil, we tend to assimilate people into our culture. We don't have different. It's a different approach to diversity, but still we think we are a very diverse society. But we will need to touch that, because I think this will have huge ramifications in politics, in the way we can pacify and unify our societies. So definitely an issue that we cannot hide under the carpet anymore.
Thank you, Ilona. Gabriel, I'd like to direct the question to you as well. Obviously, Colombia has a very large Afro-descendant population as well. How has this killing reverberated in Colombia, if at all? And has it sparked protests and serious conversations in Colombia about the treatment of Afro-descendants and other minorities? And then I also know that you didn't have the chance to address Ken's reversibility question. So if you want to fold that into this race relations question, that would be wonderful.
That's great. I think that in Colombia, the issue has a different connotation than what is Ilona describing in Brazil. We have police killings, but they are not really as targeted or as clearly biased, in the sense that it has a racial connotation of that strength. And the previous or the current constitution that was issued in 1991 created an earmark participation for Black communities in Congress that has helped significantly. Also, there is a constitutional protection for Black communities in terms of their rights, their territories, their culture. So there is a sense in Colombia that there is instruments to protect the Afro population, the Afro-Colombian population. So the discussion is more in terms of economics, less about violence. It's more about economic discrimination than racially motivated violence or force against Black communities. So there's a difference, but the discussion is going in that direction, in the direction of economic rights. And clearly, there are many panels coming up these days among Afro-Colombian leaders and other leaders about what is going on in Colombia in terms of the Afro-Colombian population. But I think that the scale and the focus is a little different than in Brazil. In relation to reversibility, for the sake of arguing and spicing the debate, I will say that everything is reversible, and I agree with Robert about that. But I think that it's also an issue of time and timing. What we are seeing currently in global affairs is a tendency to autarky, and particularly when you have strong domestic issues, as the U.S. is going to confront in the coming years. So I think that expecting that the U.S. is going to go back to a proactive normalcy in which they lead by example is something that I don't expect quite soon. I think that the U.S. has to be concentrated, and is going to be concentrated in their own weaknesses, and particularly the racial injustice and social injustice issues, and that will really colonize the public debate in the U.S. So I think that also the deterioration or erosion of globalization has increased protectionist forces. Trade agreements are really in question, and so on and so forth. So autarky is going to be like the command of the era, and in that context, I don't see a role for the U.S. that is going to be similar to the one that we saw in the past. Beyond that, the competition among powers has escalated to a point that China is changing its also isolationist policy to a more proactive policy, not only to sell things or find investment opportunities, but also to interact diplomatically in a more effective way. So it's going to be a different world. I think that later than sooner, we're going to see a U.S. coming back to be an example. So that's when Canada and New Zealand and women's leadership turns to be the idea that we should consider to reshape our political system.
Thank you so much, Gabriel. On that note, I would be also remiss if I didn't plug the Two Gringos with Questions interview with former New Zealand Prime Minister Helen Clark, which was fantastic and also spoke to the power of women leaders in this unique historical moment and the success that they've had both in COVID and on other fronts. I'd like to take this question also to Robert in Chile. The question of the George Floyd protests. In Chile, we saw images of unidentifiable security agents, much like we've seen in the U.S. In the U.S., it was apparently from the Bureau of Prisons, and we saw the use of rubber bullets on peaceful protesters. I think, according to Chile's Institute for Human Rights, hundreds were blinded by rubber bullets in Chile, and we saw the same thing here. Again, I'm in D.C. We saw the same thing here. Do you see these similarities in terms of the protests in the aftermath of the George Floyd killing here and the protests in Chile late last year? And what might we learn from Chile in this moment? Because at the height of the political protests in Chile, there was a lot of talk in the Chilean government calling for revisions of police protocols and reforms, much like we're seeing now in the United States. Is there something we might learn from Chile in this moment, particularly for those in the U.S. government and those taking to the streets now, calling for change from the experience of these examples of police brutality?
I think the similarities have to do with, they go deeper than the police reaction itself. I once asked, I think this was during the 2011 student protests, and where also you got basically every protest would start off peacefully and would end up in some sort of disorder and riot and violence. And I have a colleague named Lucia Dammert, who's an expert in public security, and I asked her why this was the case. And she said, generally speaking, societies have police forces that reflect their own preferences, their own insecurities, and Chileans have a fairly low tolerance for disorder, and so they're willing to tolerate that kind of police response because they tend to value or feel very uncomfortable when you see a huge amount of people marching down the street, even if it's peaceful. Now, we've had several peaceful, I mean, you have to say we've had several peaceful protests too, millions of people on the streets. In fact, that huge peaceful movement is what really changed the tenor of the whole discussion towards solutions that had to do with a new constitution, that had to do with social policy, and moved it away specifically from the issue of the fare hikes on the subway. So that participation was very important, and for the most part went off peacefully, and people were gathering. And then we had this thing where it became every Friday night a kind of, at least from October to February, every Friday night was the big peaceful protest in Plaza Italia. So I suspect in the States there's something similar. Despite everything, and I think this is perhaps what's beginning to change now, or what cracked in the United States. But up until now, the United States was a society which valued order, and the way of enforcing that order was sometimes through quite violent means on the part of police. So it's not necessarily that the police itself, this is the case too, but it's not only that the police has problems in terms of its treatment of minorities or protests or whatever. It's also that the society as a whole uses the police to impose the kind of order that it values. Now, what's happened is, and this leads to my second point, is that those values as a whole in society seem to be changing. And the police as an institutions always change slower than public opinion. I always say institutions are kind of like aircraft carriers that are very, very slow to turn around. But public opinion, especially in the age of social media, changes very quickly. And this is a huge challenge for institutions. And that takes me to my second point. In Chile, the police, Carabineros, historically was one of the most trusted institutions in Chilean society. And in a society where many other institutions were not necessarily trusted, such as political parties or Congress and so on. And yet, over the last few years, that has dropped off dramatically, together with other important institutions, such as the Catholic Church and others. And I think, and I suspect that in the United States and in other places, this is a big part of the problem. That it's what's happening with the police and the questioning of police has to be seen in the broader context of a general questioning of any political institution and a rejection of political institutions, and we're not sure what's going to replace them. So in the States now, we have a debate which is not too dissimilar to Chile, which is we need to defund the police. We need to restructure the police. We need to reorganize it. But what replaces it? In the same way that we don't know what replaces representative democracy, we don't know what will replace political parties, all these other things that are being questioned, particularly by a younger generation. So Chile's discussion in that sense, I think, is a precursor to things that may happen in the States, not just regarding police reform, but regarding institutional change as a whole.
Thank you, Robert. We've abused people's time now. We said it would be an hour, but I want to give Soledad the last question. And in a way, Soledad, are you saying that that you're hoping for perhaps a democratic victory to save Mexico from some of AMLO's anti-democratic impulses? Is that a feeling among some people in Mexico that not only would it be good for the United States, but it might be good for Mexico as well?
It might be good for Mexico, yes, but I don't know how this, not intervention, but this influence may be played. Intervention is too strong a thing, and we have always resented that. And at the same time, we recognize the importance of the U.S. influence. Even if the U.S. doesn't exercise any power directly against Mexico or on Mexico, it's going to be an influence because it's so strong, because it's so close. I'm not sure about a Democrat victory in Mexico in the future. Democrats have also been very indifferent, or at least not particularly nice to Mexico. But we feel much better with Democrats than with Republicans. I'm not sure why. What I would like to say something about reversibility, because we were so taken by democratic transitions that we never thought that it could be reversed. And that is what is happening all over. In Mexico, we were very proud of our democratic changes in the last 25 years. Now the president today is going back on those changes too. That's his intention. He hasn't really started with that, but we all know that that is his intention. And for that, that's why I was mentioning the importance of presidential regimes. Presidential regimes are prone to concentrate power. And I think that the Mexican president wants to concentrate power again. And I'm not sure, I don't think that Joe Biden would concentrate power or anything. Quite the contrary, I think that he would work with Congress, and that would be a good thing for Mexico, to feel that the presidential model can be democratic and not necessarily authoritarian as it is being exercised now. That would be good for Mexico. What would be good for Mexico would also be, I think, to have a neighbor that understands that many of the problems Mexico has needs a bilateral solution, need bilateral solutions. That has to do with drug trafficking, it has to do with the immigration. Up until now, Mexicans have been the ones who are to blame for what happens in terms of violence, when violence has to do with drug trafficking, or in terms of immigration, when it has to do maybe with the unfair treatment on the part of the U.S. of Mexican products or exports. So the moment there's a president in the U.S. and the moment the American public opinion understands that many of the problems that they blame on Mexico are problems that need a bilateral solution, then I think that things may work much better than until now.
Thank you, Soledad. Well, we've gone about 15 minutes over the allotted time that we asked people to reserve for this, so we should close it and not abuse the time of our panelists today. We thank all of them for those very informative comments. This is not the last kinds of events that we will be doing. The collaboration between Canadian Council for the Americas and Global Americans has been quickly has become very, very deep, and we both appreciate it very much. And we will be doing a lot more of these in the coming weeks. So please look to our websites for more information. Guy, if there's any final words you would like to say, I give you the honor of closing the event.
Yeah, I just wanted to thank our distinguished panelists and all the attendees who took time out of their day for this really important and timely conversation. And we look forward to having you join us in the coming presentations. And like Ken said, we're really grateful for the collaboration that we have with the Canadian Council of the Americas, and look forward to deepening that in the weeks and months ahead.
Thank you, everybody. Have a good day.
Thank you very much.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.